She thought it would be a normal day at the clinic until she noticed a tattoo with numbers on a patient during an examination. A moment later, she realized she had seen them before, and this discovery changed her life forever. Subscribe and write where you're watching this from. The morning began the way it always did for Lauren Carter, with the quiet hum of routine wrapping around her like a warm, familiar coat. The alarm clock's soft chime stirred her from sleep, and the scent of rain drifted through the slightly cracked bedroom window, a faint, earthy reminder that the city had been soaked overnight. She moved through her morning rituals with the easy precision of someone who had performed them countless times before. Shower, uniform, coffee brewing on the counter, while the kettle hissed faintly in the background. Her two-story house in the old part of town held a comfortable sort of wear, the kind that came from generations passing through its rooms, leaving behind memories in the worn floorboards and the faint scratches along the banister. Lauren sipped her coffee slowly, glancing at the muted television in the kitchen corner. The news anchors mouthed words about traffic delays and gray clouds lingering over the city, but she wasn't paying attention. Her thoughts were already turning toward the day ahead. The clinic where she worked was a place of order and routine, a haven for her in a city that could sometimes feel chaotic. Every shift had its rhythm: patient charts, vital signs, blood draws, quiet exchanges with colleagues, and the occasional laugh shared in the staff break room. There were emergencies, of course. No medical workplace was without them, but more often than not, her days passed with a steady, predictable pace. The drive to work was uneventful. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, mist clinging to the windshield as she navigated familiar streets. She passed the bakery, with its neon sign flickering in the dim light, the corner store with its cluttered window displays, and the stretch of old row houses where paint peeled from the siding like aging skin. By the time she reached the clinic's parking lot, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the air heavy with moisture and the faint scent of wet asphalt. Inside, the building felt almost hushed. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the linoleum floors gleamed under the meticulous care of the night cleaning crew. Lauren exchanged greetings with the receptionist, a soft-spoken woman named Monica, and nodded to a couple of other nurses already making their way toward the patient rooms. There was no frenetic rush today. No urgent cases waiting to be triaged. It was the kind of shift that Lauren appreciated, enough to keep her busy without tipping over into the overwhelming. She settled into her workspace, reviewing the morning's patient list and preparing the necessary supplies. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp and clean, mixing with the faint aroma of burnt coffee drifting from the staff room down the hall. Outside the narrow window, drops of water clung to the glass, catching the light in small glimmers. Everything felt calm, ordinary, just as it had on countless other days. She found comfort in that sameness. In a job where lives could change in an instant, routine was an anchor. By early afternoon, she had seen a steady stream of patients. Each interaction was familiar: smiles, polite questions, the careful wrapping of a tourniquet, the quick prick of a needle, and the gentle reassurance that the discomfort would pass. She moved through each step almost without thinking, her hands sure and practiced. The rain had begun again, tapping lightly against the windows, a sound so constant it faded into the background. It was during this quiet stretch that the door to her room opened and a man stepped inside. He looked to be in his early 50s, with neatly trimmed hair that was beginning to silver at the temples. His clothing was understated but well made: a dark button-down shirt, pressed slacks, polished shoes. He carried himself with the kind of posture that spoke of discipline, perhaps military or law enforcement. His expression was calm, polite, and his eyes were sharp, assessing the room with a brief glance before meeting hers. Lauren greeted him with the same warm professionalism she offered every patient and gestured for him to take a seat. He moved with quiet confidence, settling into the chair and rolling up his sleeve without being prompted. She reached for the supplies, her movements fluid and unhurried, the conversation starting in the easy, surface-level way it often did. The weather, the drive-in, the faintly bitter coffee from the vending machine. Small talk meant to fill the space and keep the patient at ease. As she reached for his arm, preparing to apply the tourniquet, her gaze caught on something she hadn't expected. Ink. Faded slightly with time, but still sharp in its clarity. A small set of numbers was tattooed just above the bend of his elbow. 2107-314. The digits were precise, evenly spaced, rendered in stark black against his skin. They looked familiar. Too familiar. Her hand hesitated for the briefest moment before she forced herself to continue, slipping the band into place and focusing on the task at hand. But inside her mind, something shifted. The numbers sat in her thoughts like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples she couldn't ignore. She didn't know why they struck her so strongly. There was no obvious reason for recognition, and yet they pulled at her memory like a half-forgotten dream that hovered just out of reach. She finished the draw efficiently, labeling the vial and releasing the tourniquet with a practiced ease, all while that small patch of ink remained burned into her vision. When the man left, taking his calm demeanor and quiet presence with him, the room felt subtly different. The steady rhythm of her day had been interrupted, not by an emergency or a medical complication, but by a fragment of something she couldn't name. She tried to shake it off, to turn her attention back to the next patient, but the numbers stayed. They floated at the edges of her mind, stubborn and insistent, and no amount of routine could push them away. By the time her shift edged toward its final hours, the rain had stopped again, leaving streaks of pale sunlight filtering weakly through the clouds. The clinic was as quiet as it had been all day, but inside Lauren there was a restlessness she couldn't explain. She moved through the motions, polite and steady on the outside, but inwardly turning those numbers over and over, searching for where they might fit. She knew she had seen them before. She just couldn't yet remember when. It wasn't until she was walking toward the parking lot, the cool, damp air brushing against her face, that the faintest flicker of memory stirred, a hazy image of a sunlit porch, the faint creak of wood underfoot, and an arm tanned from summer, with a string of black numbers inked into the skin. An arm she thought she knew. An arm from years ago. The thought sent a quiet shiver down her spine. She told herself it was nothing. But even as she unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, she knew she was lying. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual, though the route was the same she had traveled countless times before. The wipers swished lazily across the windshield, pushing aside beads of rain that still clung stubbornly to the glass. The late afternoon light was dim, smudged by clouds that pressed low over the city. Lauren's hands rested on the steering wheel, her eyes on the road, but her mind wandered to the man in the clinic chair and the small strip of black ink etched into his skin. She told herself to stop thinking about it, to let it go the way she let go of so many other fleeting patient details, but the numbers refused to leave her alone. They had lodged themselves in her thoughts, stubborn as a splinter, and every time she tried to push them away, They returned with more insistence. By the time she turned onto her street, she realized she had barely noticed the drive at all. It was as if she had been on autopilot, her body moving through the familiar motions while her mind replayed the scene over and over. The man's calm, easy manner, the faint scrape of the chair legs on the floor as he sat down, the way the fluorescent light fell on his arm and illuminated the tattoo. 21-07-314. The numbers repeated silently in her head like a chant, their rhythm unshakable. There was something about them, something that had hooked into her memory, though she couldn't yet grasp what it was. She pulled into her driveway and killed the engine, sitting there for a moment while the rain whispered against the roof of the car. The house loomed quiet in front of her, the windows pale in the gloom. It was the same house she had lived in for years, the one she had inherited after her parents moved south. Every wall, every floorboard carried echoes of the past. She should have gone inside and started dinner, maybe turned on the television to drown out the restless turning of her thoughts, but instead she stayed in the driver's seat, fingers drumming absently against the wheel. The image came to her without warning, sharp enough to make her breath catch. A warm summer day, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and sun-baked wood, a porch painted white but weathered by decades. And there, an arm resting casually on the porch railing, skin deepened by the sun, the faint gleam of sweat along the forearm. She remembered seeing the black numbers there once before, though she couldn't recall the full context. It was a memory so faint it felt almost imagined, but the feeling it stirred in her was real. Lauren shook her head and finally stepped out of the car, her shoes crunching softly on the damp gravel of the driveway. Inside, the house greeted her with its familiar quiet, the faint creak of the front door and the cool stillness that came from rooms shut up all day. She hung her coat, kicked off her shoes, and stood in the hallway, listening. The memory nagged at her, teasing the edges of her mind. She felt it there, just beyond reach, like the tip of a word on her tongue. She moved into the kitchen, put water on to boil for tea, and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. The rain had eased into a mist, beading along the window pane. Somewhere, she thought, there had to be proof of what she had seen in her mind. A photograph, maybe, tucked away in one of the old albums her family had kept for decades. The thought struck her with sudden certainty. She could almost see it. A photograph from her childhood summers spent visiting her grandfather, back when life had seemed slower and simpler. He had been a man of quiet strength, not much for words, but his presence had filled a room. He had always seemed older than time to her, and yet there had been a vitality in him, something she hadn't understood as a child but recognized now as she thought back. The kettle began to whistle, sharp and sudden, pulling her from her thoughts. She poured the water over the tea bag but barely tasted the first sip. Her mind was already moving ahead, picturing the attic above her head, the wooden stairs that folded down from the ceiling, the boxes and trunks stacked in the dim light. She knew the family albums were up there, along with other keepsakes, old clothes, her father's tools, books that smelled of dust and age. It had been years since she had last gone through them, but the idea of doing so tonight had taken hold of her with the same quiet insistence as the numbers themselves. Lauren sat for a while at the kitchen table, sipping her tea and listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock. She thought about her day, about the man in the chair, about the way his eyes had been open and friendly until the moment she saw the tattoo. Had he noticed her pause? Had he recognized something in her face? She wasn't sure, but she remembered the way he had left, calm and polite, and how the room had seemed emptier afterward. She finished her tea and carried the cup to the sink, rinsing it out under a stream of warm water. Her gaze drifted toward the ceiling, toward the corner of the hallway where the attic stairs were hidden behind a small square door. A faint unease stirred in her, part curiosity, part something deeper, something she couldn't name. She knew that whatever she found up there might change how she remembered her family, and the thought both excited and unsettled her. The rest of the evening passed in a kind of slow suspension. She made herself a simple dinner, barely tasting the food, and sat with a book open on her lap but didn't turn a single page. Every few minutes her eyes would lift towards the ceiling again, toward the attic, as if the old boards above were whispering to her. The numbers continued to loop through her mind, and with each repetition the connection to her grandfather seemed stronger, more certain. She could almost feel herself standing on that porch again, a child looking up at him, the sun in her eyes and the mysterious ink on his skin just visible beneath the edge of his sleeve. By the time she finally rose from the couch, the house was dark except for the small pool of light in the living room. She turned it off and stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to the quiet. The attic could wait until tomorrow, she told herself, but even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't wait. Something had been set in motion today, and it wouldn't stop until she knew the truth. She reached for the pull cord that would bring the attic stairs down and felt the dust on her fingers before she even touched it. The stairs creaked faintly as they unfolded, and she hesitated, hand on the railing, staring up into the shadows above. The air from the attic carried a dry, musty scent, tinged with the faint sweetness of old paper and wood. She thought of her grandfather then, of the way he had looked when he smiled, and of how much of his life had remained a mystery even to those closest to him. If the numbers on that man's arm were the same as the ones she remembered from her grandfather's, then somewhere up there, hidden in the stacks of forgotten things, she would find the proof. And as she climbed the first few steps into the darkness, she felt the pull of memory grow stronger, leading her toward a past she had never fully understood and a story she had not yet been told. Lauren's foot pressed into the first step, and the attic stair groaned under her weight, as if resenting being disturbed after years of neglect. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness above. The glow from the hallway barely reached past the first few feet of the opening, and beyond that lay shadows that seemed dense enough to hold secrets. The smell was stronger now. Dust, dry wood, and that faint, unmistakable scent of things kept far too long. She gripped the railing, her palm brushing over the cold metal, and continued upward, each step bringing a quiet creak, as if the house itself were taking notice of her ascent. When her head rose above the floor of the attic, she could see the familiar silhouettes of old furniture draped in yellowed sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and a few framed pictures leaning against the far wall. The single bulb overhead hung from a wire in the center of the room, its pull cord swaying slightly as if stirred by her arrival. She crossed the final step and reached up, tugging the cord. The light flickered twice before holding steady, casting a pale glow that pushed back the shadows just enough to reveal the cluttered expanse. She had been here before, of course, but never with such a sense of purpose. The attic had always been a place of mild curiosity, a storage room for the remnants of other lives, other times. Now it felt like a vault, and somewhere inside that vault was the key to the numbers that had been echoing in her head all day. She moved slowly at first, lifting a corner of a dust cover to peer at the shape beneath. A rocking chair, its once polished arms worn smooth by hands long gone. a small table with a cracked edge, stacks of books whose spines had faded to the same muted beige. All of it was familiar in the way family relics always were, even if she hadn't touched them in years. Her attention drifted to a large wooden cabinet in the far corner. Its surface was dull with age, but the brass handles still caught the light in a muted glint. She remembered her father telling her that the cabinet had belonged to her grandfather, passed down from his own father before him. She hadn't thought of it in years, but now something about it pulled at her. She crossed the floor, dust motes swirling in her wake, and rested her hand on the cool wood. For a moment, she hesitated, as though opening it might unleash something she couldn't put back. The cabinet door stuck at first, the wood swollen with age, but she pulled harder and it came open with a sighing sound, releasing a puff of dust that made her cough and turn her head. Inside, the shelves were crowded with boxes of varying sizes, most of them plain brown, their corners softened and edges frayed. Some had faded writing on them, dates, brief descriptions, but many were unmarked. She reached for one of the smaller boxes near the front, lifting it carefully. It was heavier than she expected, its weight shifting slightly as she carried it to a nearby trunk to set it down. Lifting the lid released another wave of dust, and she waved her hand to clear it before looking inside. The box was filled with photographs, postcards, and a few brittle envelopes. She began to sift through them slowly, her fingers brushing over the slick surfaces of old prints. Most of the photographs were black and white, their edges scalloped in that style popular decades ago. Others were sepia-toned, giving them the warm, nostalgic feel of something from a distant era. And then, tucked between a photo of a street parade and an image of two boys fishing at a lake, she found what she had been looking for. It was a photograph she recognized instantly, though she couldn't remember the last time she had seen it. Her grandfather stood on the wooden porch of a small house, the summer sun bright enough to cast sharp shadows behind him. He was young here, much younger than in the images she had grown up with, his face unlined, his stance casual. His right arm rested on the porch railing, and there, just above the bend of his elbow, were the numbers: 21, 07, 314. The ink looked as fresh as it must have been back then, the lines dark and clear against his skin. Lauren's breath caught, and she lowered herself onto the trunk, the photograph trembling slightly in her hands. Seeing it here, in this context, made the connection undeniable. The man in her clinic today and her grandfather decades ago carried the same mark, not just similar, identical in style, placement, and sequence. She stared at the numbers, her mind racing through possibilities. Coincidence seemed impossible now. There had to be a story behind this, something her family had never told her. She leaned back slightly, the wood of the trunk pressing into her spine, and let the memories wash over her. Summers spent at her grandfather's house, the creak of the porch boards beneath her bare feet, the smell of his aftershave mingling with the scent of fresh-cut grass. She remembered sitting on the porch steps, her knees scraped from some small adventure, looking up at him as he handed her a glass of lemonade. She had noticed the tattoo once, maybe twice, but she had been too young to think much of it. She had assumed it was just something from his younger days, the way some men had old army insignias or names inked on their skin. No one in the family had ever explained it to her, and eventually she had stopped wondering. But now, the image of the man in the clinic, his easy smile vanishing the moment she mentioned the tattoo, refused to fade. That reaction alone told her there was meaning behind the numbers, something guarded, perhaps even secret. She slipped the photograph from the stack and held it separately, as if afraid it might vanish among the others. Setting the box aside, she rose and moved to the cabinet again, pulling out another box, this one larger and more worn. It contained more photographs, but also a few leather-bound journals, their covers cracked and brittle with age. She flipped one open, scanning the pages for anything that might resemble the numbers or mention them, but the handwriting. Her grandfather's, she thought, was looping and difficult to read. Most entries seemed mundane: weather notes, brief mentions of errands, visits from neighbors. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answer might be here somewhere. She stacked the journals neatly beside her and returned to the first photograph, studying it again. The setting looked rural, the house behind him small and simple, the kind of place where people knew all their neighbors and news traveled faster than the wind. She tried to place the date, maybe the late 1960s, judging by the clothes and the style of the photograph. Her grandfather would have been in his 20s then, just before or after meeting her grandmother. A thought came to her suddenly, unbidden but persistent. Her mother. Her mother had grown up with this man. She might know the story behind the numbers, might have even seen the tattoo every day in her childhood. But if that were true, then why had she never mentioned it? Lauren's mind began to turn toward questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask, questions that might shift the way she saw her family forever. She placed the photograph gently on top of the journals, her fingers lingering on the image as though, by touch alone, she could draw the truth from it. The attic felt warmer now, the air thick and still. She could hear the faint patter of rain resuming against the roof, a soft, irregular rhythm that matched the unsettled beat of her heart. She gathered the photograph, the journals, and a few other items from the boxes, stacking them carefully before carrying them toward the attic stairs. The bulb overhead swayed slightly as she passed beneath it, casting the room into brief shadows before returning it to light. Descending into the hallway, she felt as though she carried more than just the weight of old paper and photographs. She carried a thread that, once pulled, might unravel a tapestry she had always taken for granted. The numbers were no longer just an odd curiosity on a stranger's arm. They were a bridge between the past and the present, and Lauren knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she crossed it. Lauren placed the photograph carefully on the coffee table, the edges catching the light from the single lamp in her living room. The journals and other items she had taken from the attic sat beside it in a neat stack, though she hadn't yet summoned the nerve to open them again. The rain outside had grown heavier, pattering insistently against the windows and filling the silence of the house with its steady presence. She sat on the couch, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees, staring at the image of her grandfather. The numbers on his arm seemed to stare back, their meaning locked away somewhere between the paper and her memory. She had spent the better part of the last hour turning the photograph over in her hands, examining it from every angle as though she might uncover some hidden clue. The back of the photo was blank, except for a faint fingerprint smudge in the corner. There was nothing to indicate when it had been taken. No note or date, but she could feel it belonged to another time entirely, one she hadn't lived through, yet somehow was now being pulled toward. She wanted answers, but she also knew that the only person alive who might have them was her mother, and speaking to her about this would not be simple. Her mother had always been protective of the family's past, a gatekeeper of certain stories while leaving others untold. Lauren could recall times as a child when she had asked questions about her grandfather and had been met with vague, almost dismissive answers. At the time, she'd accepted them, distracted by the concerns of childhood. But now, with the photograph in hand and the tattoo fresh in her mind from the clinic, she couldn't accept the silence any longer. She reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating above the screen. Calling her mother about something like this felt different from their usual conversations about work or errands or holiday plans. This was personal, and it might open a door neither of them could close. Still, the urge to know outweighed the discomfort. She dialed the number and listened to the line ring, her pulse ticking faster with each sound until she heard the familiar voice on the other end. Her mother's tone was warm but distracted, as though she'd been in the middle of something. Lauren tried to ease into the subject, asking how she was, making a few casual remarks. But it didn't take long before the photograph was burning in her lap again, and she found herself saying that she'd been going through some old family things from the attic. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that was too long to be casual. She mentioned the photograph of her grandfather on the porch, and how she'd noticed the tattoo on his arm. Another pause, longer this time. When her mother finally spoke, her voice had changed, slower, more guarded. She said it was an old story, one not worth digging up, something from a time when the world was different and not always in a good way. Lauren pressed gently, asking if the numbers meant anything, if they were related to his work, or to some place he'd been. Her mother's answer was evasive, telling her only that the tattoo was connected to a period in his life that had been difficult, that involved things he didn't talk about. "Some things are better left where they are," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality. But Lauren had learned to listen not just to her mother's words, but to what lay beneath them. And beneath this careful, restrained answer, she could hear the faint rustle of something unspoken, something heavy enough to still have weight after all these years. She asked if it had anything to do with the old rail depot, the one her grandfather had sometimes mentioned in passing. This time, her mother made a small sound, a sharp inhale, almost too quiet to notice, and said only that the depot had been a place where people came together in good times and bad, and where some events were better left to memory. The conversation ended shortly afterward, her mother retreating into polite distance, changing the subject to the weather before excusing herself. Lauren set the phone down and stared at it, feeling a mixture of frustration and resolve. Her mother's reluctance only confirmed what she had suspected. The tattoo meant something significant, and it was tied to a story the family had chosen to bury. But why? And why now, after all these years, was it reappearing on the arm of a stranger in her clinic? She leaned back into the couch, letting the questions settle over her like the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. The rain had softened again, and in the quiet she thought of the depot her mother had all but admitted was connected to the tattoo. She could picture it, only vaguely from descriptions, a long, low building of weathered brick, tracks running past it like lines on an old map. In her mind, the image merged with the photograph, her grandfather standing on that porch as if keeping watch over something more than just a small-town street. The more she thought about it, the more she sensed that whatever had happened there was not simply a matter of personal history, but something larger, perhaps tied to the time and place in which he had lived. The late 1960s were not an easy time for a young black man, especially in a small town where lines between communities could be as sharp as the edge of a blade. If the tattoo marked an event, it might have been something dangerous, something that left scars on more than just skin. Lauren rose and paced slowly across the living room, her mind circling the possibilities. She considered the man from the clinic again, his composed demeanor, the way his expression had shifted the moment she mentioned the tattoo. He knew something. She was certain of it. And now her mother's guarded tone suggested she might know it too, even if she wasn't willing to share. That left Lauren caught between two silences, each holding a piece of the truth she was trying to uncover. She returned to the coffee table, picked up the photograph, and studied it once more. Her grandfather's gaze was steady, almost challenging, as though he were aware that someday someone would be looking back at him, trying to piece together what he had left unsaid. The numbers on his arm seemed to hum with quiet significance. She traced them lightly with her fingertip, feeling the faint texture of the photo paper beneath her skin. In that moment, the choice became clear. If her mother would not tell her, she would have to find the answers herself. The man in the clinic was more than a coincidence. His tattoo was a direct link to her grandfather, and she needed to know why. Whatever shadows the past held, she was no longer willing to let them stand in her way. The rain outside eased into a soft drizzle, and the house seemed to settle around her as if in agreement. Lauren set the photograph down with care, her decision made. She would find out what those numbers meant, and in doing so, she would uncover the part of her family's history that had been hidden for too long. The path forward might not be simple, and it might not be safe for her peace of mind, but it was already set in motion the moment she had seen that tattoo. There was no turning back now. Lauren woke the next morning with the photograph still resting on the nightstand beside her bed, as if it had been keeping watch while she slept. She had not planned to bring it upstairs the night before, but something about its presence in the living room had made her uneasy, as though it might disappear if she left it unattended. Now, in the pale light of early day, the image looked the same as it had in the dim glow of the lamp. Her grandfather, steady-eyed, the numbers standing out like a message she still couldn't read. The restless thoughts that had followed her into sleep returned before she had even sat up. She was no closer to understanding the truth, and every attempt to push it to the back of her mind only sharpened her need to act. The conversation with her mother had closed one door, but it had opened another, and she could feel herself standing on the threshold. At work, the routine was both a comfort and a distraction she barely managed to maintain. The faces of her patients blurred together, her hands moving automatically as she took vitals, prepared syringes, and entered notes into the system. But beneath that steady professional rhythm was a second pulse, a quiet insistence telling her that waiting was no longer an option. If she wanted to know who the man in her clinic truly was, and how he was connected to her grandfather, she had the means to find out, though those means were ones she had no right to use. She had been in this profession long enough to know exactly where the ethical lines were drawn, and she had always stayed well within them. Until now. It began with a glance at her computer screen during a lull between patients. She brought up the secure database, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. The thought of what she was about to do tightened her chest, but the thought of not doing it seemed impossible. She typed in the man's patient record, his name flashing on the screen alongside the date and time of his appointment. There it was. His address, phone number, and the file containing the results of the standard blood work he had come in for. She hesitated, her cursor blinking as if in warning. But the ethical voice inside her was growing fainter under the weight of a different one, a voice that told her she was not violating his privacy for idle curiosity, but for something bigger, something that touched her family in a way she still didn't understand. Her eyes fell to the small sample ID number assigned to his vial of blood. She knew the lab process inside and out, where samples went, who handled them, how long results took. With the right note in the system, she could have a duplicate of his sample sent for additional testing without raising suspicion. It was a calculated risk, one that would leave no obvious trail unless someone was looking very closely. Even as she moved to make the entry, she could feel her heartbeat in her ears. This was more than bending the rules. This was breaking them. She completed the notation and sent the request to the lab, marking it in the system under a vague but acceptable pretense. The request would be processed automatically, without the need for anyone's verbal approval. When she leaned back in her chair, she felt an unexpected mixture of dread and relief. The step had been taken. There was no undoing it now. The waiting began almost immediately, though she knew it would be days before anything returned. She tried to lose herself in work, to let the steady rhythm of the clinic carry her through the hours, but the decision she had made clung to her like a second skin. Every interaction felt faintly altered, every patient a reminder of the rules she had just broken for one of them. She told herself that she would make it right later, that the circumstances justified her choice, but deep down she knew there was no way to soften what she had done. By the end of the week, she was counting the days. The official timeline for lab processing was always at least 2 weeks, sometimes more, but that didn't stop her from checking her mailbox every evening as soon as she got home. She found herself imagining what she might do with the results once they arrived. If they confirmed her suspicion that the man was somehow related to her, she would have proof, not just a hunch built on the fragile link of a tattoo. And if they didn't, she didn't let herself finish the thought. In her mind, there was no real possibility of coincidence. The dreams began during the second week. At first, they were vague, images of her grandfather, of the porch from the photograph, of summer heat and the sound of distant train whistles. But soon they deepened into something more vivid. She saw fire in the distance, heard voices shouting in panic, felt the tremor of footsteps running past her. She woke from those dreams with her heart pounding, the smell of smoke lingering in her mind. They weren't memories. She hadn't been alive when those events, if they were real, had happened, but they felt like echoes of someone else's life, passed down without words. On the 12th day, she returned home to find a thick envelope in her mailbox. The sight of it stopped her in her tracks. She took it inside, her keys still in her hand, and sat down at the kitchen table. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her pulse quickening. The lab's return address was printed in neat black letters. She ran her thumb along the sealed flap, then tore it open in one swift motion. The results were straightforward, no more than a few printed pages. But the words on them pulled her forward like a tide. The comparison had been made. The genetic markers matched. There was no mistaking it. The man was related to her, not distantly, but within the range of extended family. The paper even offered a likelihood, high enough to make her breath catch. She read the pages twice, then set them down and stared at the wall, feeling the truth settle in around her. He wasn't just a patient. He was part of her bloodline. Lauren didn't know whether to feel vindicated or unnerved. The proof she had sought was in her hands, but it came with no explanation. The questions had only multiplied. How did he know about her grandfather? Had he known they were related when he walked into the clinic? And why carry that same tattoo, the exact one her grandfather had worn decades ago? The answer, she knew, lay with him. She couldn't imagine her mother volunteering any more information, not after their last conversation. That left one option. She would have to go to him directly. She picked up the results again, scanning for the detail she knew would be there. The database had given her his address, and the report listed it as well, an old street in a neighboring town, no more than a 40-minute drive away. She recognized the area in a vague way, remembering passing through it on the way to other places. She thought about the photograph again, about the depot her mother had all but admitted was tied to the tattoo. The address was only a few miles from the rail line. She couldn't ignore the feeling that this was no coincidence either. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, the photograph and the lab report spread out in front of her. The rain had returned, tapping softly against the window. She imagined the man's reaction when she appeared at his door. She imagined his eyes, the way they might narrow in recognition or widen in surprise. She wondered if he would try to turn her away, or if he would see in her the same connection she now saw in him. The thought both unsettled and compelled her. By the time she rose from the table, her mind was made up. She would go to him. Whatever he knew, whatever piece of her grandfather's story he carried, she needed to hear it from him. She gathered the photograph and the report, tucking them carefully into her bag, and turned off the light. As she climbed the stairs to bed, she felt the weight of her choice settle over her. This was a step she could never take back, the one that crossed the last invisible line. She had begun this search with a single image, but now it was carrying her into a place where the past and the present were bound together, and where the truth waited, patient and unyielding, for her to come and claim it. The morning she chose to make the drive began with an almost unsettling calm. Lauren awoke earlier than usual, the pale gray of dawn filtering through her curtains and casting a muted glow across the room. For a few moments she lay still, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional drip of water in the gutters outside. Her decision from the night before weighed on her, solid and immovable. She had made up her mind to see him, this man whose name she had committed to memory from the lab report, whose address was written in her own neat hand on the small notepad by the phone. The knowledge of their relation no longer felt abstract. It sat in her chest like something tangible, demanding to be acknowledged. She went through her morning routine without rushing, but with a sense of forward motion, as though each small action was another step toward the inevitable. The steam from her shower curled around her, warm and comforting, but she could not relax into it. Her thoughts kept looping back to what she might say when he opened the door, how she would introduce herself, whether she should mention the photograph immediately, or wait to see if he recognized her on his own. The uncertainty of his reaction left her uneasy. She reminded herself that there was no script for this kind of meeting. All she could do was follow the truth to wherever it led. The drive took her out of the city and into quieter streets where the buildings stood farther apart and the trees grew taller, their branches tangled against the overcast sky. The rain had stopped during the night, but the roads were still damp, reflecting dull streaks of light from the occasional passing car. She kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting lightly on her lap, fingers occasionally tapping against her knee. Every so often, she glanced at the small slip of paper on the passenger seat to reassure herself she had the address right. As she drew closer to the neighboring town, familiar landmarks began to stir at the edges of her memory. A diner she had stopped at once on a road trip, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign that looked decades old. The GPS guided her through narrower streets, past houses that bore the marks of long habitation, worn porches, paint faded by years of sun, gardens gone dormant for winter. When the voice in the device announced that she was 5 minutes from her destination, her pulse began to pick up. She slowed slightly, scanning the house numbers, noting how quiet the neighborhood seemed at this hour. There was a stillness to it that felt almost watchful. She found the street she was looking for, a winding lane lined with maple and oak trees, their bare limbs reaching toward one another across the road. His house was set back from the street, a modest two-story structure with weathered siding and a wide front porch. The yard was tidy, though the grass was pale from the season. Behind it, she could just make out the faint lines of what had once been railroad tracks, now overgrown, but still running straight into the distance. The sight of them sent a small jolt through her, as if the past were pushing at the edges of the present. Lauren parked a short distance away, her tires crunching softly over gravel. She didn't want to pull directly into the driveway, not yet. She sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to its faint cooling ticks in the silence. From here, she could see the front door clearly, the steps leading up to it, the wooden railing worn smooth where hands had gripped it over time. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, then opened the door and stepped out into the cool air. The dampness lingered, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Her footsteps were quiet as she approached the house. The porch boards creaked faintly under her weight, an intimate sound in the still morning. She raised her hand and pressed the doorbell, the chime sounding somewhere inside. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then she heard movement, the muffled sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened a few inches, then swung wider. He was there, the man from the clinic. He looked almost exactly as he had that day, composed, watchful, his gaze taking her in with quick precision. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then a slow, knowing expression settled across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise. "You came," he said, his voice steady. "I thought you might." The sound of his voice sent a strange ripple through her, a mix of recognition and unfamiliarity. She nodded, feeling the tension in her shoulders but keeping her eyes on his. "I did," she answered quietly. There was no need to explain why. It was clear he understood. He stepped back, opening the door wider, and gestured for her to come in. The interior of the house was warm, with the faint scent of tea steeping somewhere in the background. The furniture was simple, but well cared for, the walls adorned with framed photographs and old prints. She followed him into a living room where a kettle's low whistle came from the adjoining kitchen. He motioned toward an armchair while he disappeared briefly to tend to it. When he returned, he carried a tray with 2 cups of tea, setting it on the low table between them before settling into the chair opposite hers. They regarded each other for a few moments over the steam rising from their cups. It was he who spoke first. "I imagine you've got questions. I imagine you already know the answer to some of them." His tone was measured, without hostility, but also without the easy warmth he had shown at the clinic before she mentioned the tattoo. Lauren took a sip of the tea, the heat grounding her. She reached into her bag and withdrew the photograph, placing it on the table between them. His eyes flicked to it immediately, and she saw the faintest shift in his expression as though a guarded door had opened just a fraction. "My grandfather," she said softly. "This was taken a long time ago. I think you know why I'm here." He leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees as he studied the image. "I do," he replied, "and you're right to come. There's a story here, and it belongs to both of us." What followed was not rushed. He spoke in a deliberate, careful manner, choosing his words as though laying each one in place. He told her about her grandfather, Not as the man she'd known as a child, but as a young man in a time and place where lines were drawn sharply between people. He described the old rail depot, how one summer night it had been set upon by a group intent on destruction. Fires lit the sky, smoke poured into the streets, and people were trapped inside. Her grandfather had been there. He had gone in again and again to bring people out, some of them strangers, others friends, and one in particular who would change the course of his life, a young woman who would later become this man's mother. The numbers, he explained, were coordinates. They marked the location of the depot, a place that had defined that night for everyone who had been there. Her grandfather had the tattoo made afterward, a private reminder of what had happened. The man had chosen the same design to honor both his mother's survival and the bond that act of courage had created between their families. Over the years, the truth had been kept quiet, partly out of humility, partly because not all parts of that story were safe to tell at the time. As he spoke, Lauren felt the shape of the mystery begin to resolve. She saw her grandfather not just as the figure in her memories, but as someone who had carried the weight of a defining moment for the rest of his life. She understood now why her mother had been reluctant to speak of it, not because it was shameful, but because it was bound up in pain and danger as well as pride. When the story came to a pause, they sat in silence for a while, sipping their tea. The house seemed to hold the quiet with them, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel. Finally, she looked up at him. "I wish I had known you sooner," she said. He gave a small, genuine smile. "There's still time," he replied. When she left a short while later, the clouds had thinned and the air felt lighter. She walked back to her car with the photograph tucked safely in her bag, along with something less tangible but far more valuable. A piece of her grandfather's life returned to her, carried across years by a man who had been a stranger until this morning, and was now something much more. When Lauren drove away from Edgar's house, the streets felt different than they had on the way there. The narrow lane with its bare-branched trees no longer seemed unfamiliar, and even the quiet railroad tracks behind his property felt less like relics of a forgotten past and more like a thread connecting two lives. She kept glancing at the photograph on the passenger seat, though she knew every detail of it by now. Her grandfather's steady gaze, the summer porch, the stark black numbers on his arm. It felt strange to think that just days ago those numbers had been nothing more than a curious mark on a stranger's skin. Now they were a part of a story that belonged to her, too. The drive back to her own neighborhood passed in a slow, almost reflective blur. The clouds above were breaking apart in uneven patches, letting through the brief flashes of pale afternoon sunlight. She thought about what Edgar had told her, and how his words had carried the weight of years. There had been no dramatics, no embellishments, just the simple, steady recounting of a night that had changed lives. It had been enough to rearrange the way she thought about her grandfather and, in some ways, herself. She felt a quiet pride settle in her chest, tinged with the sadness of knowing that she had learned this too late to look him in the eye and tell him what his actions had meant. When she reached her house, the familiar creak of the front door and the scent of the old wood seemed warmer than usual. She set her bag on the table, took off her coat, and moved to the living room where the journals from the attic still waited in a neat stack. She hadn't had the courage to open them fully before, but now she felt ready. She leafed through the brittle pages slowly, finding nothing directly about that night but sensing its presence between the lines. There were entries about small-town events, weather, visits with neighbors, and once or twice a vague mention of the depot, but always in a way that felt deliberately sparse, as if even in his own writing he could not bring himself to linger. The house was quiet around her, the ticking of the clock on the mantel the only sound. She realized how long she had been turning these pages, her fingers dusted faintly with paper fibers. The photograph lay nearby, and she looked at it again before slipping it back into its original box. The box felt different now, less like a container of mysteries and more like a vessel of memory. It no longer demanded answers, it offered understanding. Over the next days, she spoke with Edgar several times. Sometimes it was just a short call, other times a longer conversation that drifted between their own lives and the fragments of family history they were beginning to piece together. He told her stories about his mother, how she had carried quiet gratitude for the man who had saved her, how she had made sure her son knew about him, even if the details stayed vague. Lauren shared her own memories of her grandfather, of the porch summers, the scent of his aftershave, the way he would sit in the same chair each evening as though it were his place in the world. Together, they began to see him not just as he had been to them individually, but as a whole person, someone whose choices had rippled outward across decades. One afternoon, Edgar sent her a photo of the depot as it looked now. The building was weathered but still standing, its bricks dulled with age, the tracks beside it half buried in weeds. There was something haunting and beautiful in the image, as though the place itself remembered what had happened and had simply folded it into its walls. Lauren found herself staring at it for a long time, feeling both drawn and unsettled. She decided she needed to see it for herself. The next weekend, she made the drive to the address Edgar had given her. The day was cool and clear, the sunlight thin but steady. When she arrived, she parked nearby and walked the last short stretch. Standing in front of the depot, she could almost hear the echoes of voices, the clang of metal, the rush of movement. She imagined her grandfather there, younger, stronger, moving through smoke and chaos with the single-minded purpose of bringing people out alive. The weight of that vision pressed into her chest, not as a burden, but as a kind of grounding force. She stayed for a while, walking the length of the platform, her hand trailing over the rough brick. At one point, she stopped and simply stood still, letting the place speak in its silence. She thought about how memory could be carried in many forms, in photographs, in stories, in the ink of a tattoo, in the quiet preservation of a building that had seen more than it could tell. She thought about how those forms might fade or change, but never truly disappear. On the drive home, she knew she wanted to mark this in her own way. The idea had been growing in the back of her mind since Edgar had told her the meaning of the numbers, and by the time she reached her neighborhood, it had become certain. A week later, she sat in the quiet hum of a small tattoo studio, the artist's tools laid out neatly on a tray beside her. She had chosen the same placement as her grandfather's, the same clean style. As the numbers took shape on her skin, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her. It wasn't about copying him or the man she had met in the clinic. It was about carrying forward a piece of history that was hers now as much as theirs. When it was done, she looked at the fresh ink and felt something close to completion. The line of her family's story had bent in ways she had never expected, crossing into other lives, carrying hidden chapters she might never have found if not for one ordinary day in the clinic. She thought about the moment she had first seen Edgar, about how his easy smile had changed when she noticed the tattoo, and how that single flicker of guardedness had led her here. That night, she called him. They spoke for a long time, the conversation meandering but threaded with a quiet understanding. Before they hung up, he said, "We've both been carrying pieces of the same story without knowing it. Now we've put some of them together. There's more, I think, but that will come." She agreed, knowing that while the mystery had been resolved, the connection it had uncovered was only beginning. Later, sitting alone in her living room, Lauren glanced at the photograph once more before placing it back in the box. This time, she didn't feel the old urgency to dig for answers. She felt something gentler, something like peace. The truth she had found wasn't just about the numbers or the night at the depot. It was about the ways people's lives could be bound together across time, about courage, and about the quiet endurance of memory. As the evening deepened and the house settled into stillness, she rested her hand lightly over the new ink on her arm and knew she would carry it, and all it meant, for the rest of her life. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more stories like this, and share this video with friends so they can enjoy it too.